A sloth, a donkey, and a curious human. Send a prompt and see what they're doing. One hits record with a question on his mind. Two brothers pick it up, see what they find. Corn takes his time, Herman's got the facts. Back and forth, they never hold back. My weird prompts, come on in, that's where we begin. My weird prompts, glad you're here.
This episode was generated using artificial intelligence. Please verify facts.
Think about how we usually picture the soldier as this pinnacle of natural human discipline and training. We have this image of the Spartan or the modern special operator who wills themselves through pain and exhaustion, through sheer force of character. But when you look at the history of warfare, and especially what is happening right now in conflicts around the globe in 2026, that image of the natural soldier is largely a myth. We are looking at a history of chemical optimization. We are talking about a reality where the human body is treated as just another hardware platform that needs a software patch or a fuel additive to function in environments it was never designed to survive.
Herman Poppleberry here. You are right, Corn. It is a topic that people are often uncomfortable talking about because it feels like it takes away from the heroism. But pharmacology has been a force multiplier for as long as we have had organized conflict. Our housemate Daniel actually sent us a prompt about this recently, asking about the role of drugs in overcoming the physical limitations of the human body in war. It is a deep, dark well once you start looking into it. We are not just talking about getting high, we are talking about pharmacological warfare, where the battlefield is the human central nervous system.
It is a major shift. Daniel was asking specifically about everything from the high-tech cognitive regulators used by the United States Air Force to the cruder stimulants found in the hands of insurgents in the Middle East. It feels like we are at this point where the un-augmented human soldier might be becoming a thing of the past in high-intensity environments. If you are not chemically optimized, you are bringing a knife to a gunfight, but the knife is your own biology.
That is a fair assessment. If you are a pilot flying a 24-hour sortie or a soldier digging miles of tunnels under a city, you are fighting against millions of years of evolution. Your brain is designed to shut down after a certain point to protect itself. To keep going, you have to bypass the internal governors. Today we are going to look at how that is done, from the controlled medical protocols of modern Western militaries to the illicit, high-stakes drug use we see in asymmetric warfare. We are moving beyond the era of crude performance enhancement into an era of targeted cognitive regulation.
Let us start with the sophisticated end of the spectrum. When people think of military drug use, they might think of the Vietnam era or the World Wars, but the current state of the art in the United States military is a highly specialized system. We are talking about Modafinil. It is the gold standard right now for what the military calls fatigue management.
Right? Modafinil, which many people know by the brand name Provigil. It is often called a go pill in military circles. To understand why this is such a leap forward, you have to look at what it replaced. In World War II, the Korean War, and Vietnam, the standard was amphetamines, specifically things like benzedrine or dexedrine. These were Schedule II controlled substances that hit the brain like a sledgehammer.
Those are essentially speed then? They hit the sympathetic nervous system and flood the engine.
They are blunt instruments. They flood the system with dopamine and norepinephrine. They make you alert, yes, but they also make you jittery, paranoid, and aggressive. They create a massive debt in the body that has to be paid back with a huge crash. But modafinil is different. It is classified as a Schedule IV substance, which means it has a much lower potential for abuse and a much cleaner profile. It is what we call a eugeroic, or a wakefulness-promoting agent.
I have been reading into the mechanism of action there, and it is much more targeted than old-school speed. Instead of that total system overload, it focuses on the hypothalamus. It influences the orexin and hypocretin systems, which are the parts of the brain that actually regulate the sleep-wake cycle. It is not necessarily giving you a high. It is just preventing the brain from realizing it is tired.
That is the key distinction. It is the difference between screaming at your brain to stay awake and simply turning off the switch that tells your brain it is tired. The United States Air Force has been very open about using modafinil for long-duration missions. When you have a pilot in a single-seat cockpit for 18 or 20 hours, you cannot afford the jitteriness of traditional amphetamines. You need surgical precision and calm decision-making. If you are flying a B-2 Spirit bomber on a 40-hour round trip from Missouri to the other side of the world, you are operating in a window where human biology simply fails. Modafinil allows that pilot to maintain a baseline of cognitive function that is nearly identical to being fully rested.
The transparency there is notable. The United States has these very strict, documented protocols for go pills and no-go pills. The no-go pills are the sedatives, like zolpidem or temazepam, used to force sleep after a mission so the pilot can reset. It is a total management of the circadian rhythm. But when we look at other forces, like the Israel Defense Forces or other regional powers, the information is much more of a black box.
It is a stark contrast. There are often rumors and unconfirmed reports about pharmacological use in the Israel Defense Forces, especially for elite units like Sayeret Matkal during prolonged operations or deep reconnaissance missions. But the state is much more tight-lipped about it. In the West, we have this public debate about the ethics of it, but in a lot of other places, it is just seen as another piece of equipment, like a night vision scope or a ceramic plate. If it increases the probability of mission success and soldier survival, they use it. They do not necessarily feel the need to publish a white paper on it.
Well, if we look back at our discussion in episode 645 about the mapping of global conflict in 2026, the intensity of modern war almost demands it. But there is a cautionary tale here that we have to address. Do you remember the 2002 Tarnak Farm incident in Afghanistan?
I remember that well. That was a tragedy that forced a re-evaluation of these substances. You had two American F-16 pilots, Major Harry Schmidt and Major William Umbach, who were returning from a long mission. They saw what they thought was surface-to-air fire, but it was actually a Canadian infantry unit conducting a nighttime live-fire exercise. Schmidt dropped a laser-guided bomb, and 4 Canadians were killed.
And the defense for those pilots was that they were on dexedrine. Their lawyers argued that the go pills had impaired their judgment, creating a state of hypervigilance and cognitive tunnel vision. They argued the pilots were in a drug-induced state of paranoia where they misinterpreted a training exercise as a lethal threat.
That is the danger of the older stimulants. They create this cognitive narrowing. You are awake, but you are not necessarily wise. You are focused, but you might be focused on the wrong thing. Modafinil is supposed to mitigate that because it does not produce that same level of euphoria or peripheral nervous system stimulation. But we are still effectively borrowing energy from the future. Even if you do not feel the crash as hard, the brain still needs that restorative sleep to clear out metabolic waste like adenosine. You are running the engine without changing the oil.
It makes me wonder about the long-term cognitive costs. If you are a career pilot and you have spent 20 years intermittently bypassing your sleep-wake cycle with Provigil, what does your brain look like at age 60? We do not really have the long-term data on that yet because the widespread use of heuristics is still relatively recent in historical terms. We are talking about a generation of officers who have been chemically managed for their entire careers.
We are running a massive, high-stakes experiment on some of our most highly trained personnel. But from the military perspective, the trade-off is clear. If the choice is a pilot who is slightly cognitively taxed versus a pilot who falls asleep and crashes a $100 million aircraft, or misses a critical window for a strike, they are going to choose the drug every time. It is a cold, actuarial calculation.
Now, let us pivot from the cockpit to something much more visceral, and, frankly, much darker. We have been seeing these reports about the sheer scale of the tunnel networks in Gaza. I am talking about hundreds of miles of reinforced concrete tunnels, some of them dozens of meters underground. When you look at the sheer amount of physical labor required to dig those, often by hand or with small power tools in cramped, oxygen-deprived environments, it seems almost superhuman. It is a logistical feat that defies standard labor models.
It does, and this is where we move from the cognitive regulators to the endurance stimulants. There have been consistent reports and forensic evidence suggesting that Hamas and other insurgent groups in the region rely heavily on a drug called Captagon. This is not about precision, this is about raw, grinding endurance.
Captagon is a name that comes up constantly in Middle Eastern conflict reporting. For those who do not know, what exactly is it? Because it seems to be the fuel for the entire regional conflict right now.
It is a synthetic stimulant. Originally, it was a legitimate pharmaceutical called phenethylline, which is a co-drug of amphetamine and theophylline. It was developed in the 1960s to treat hyperactivity and narcolepsy, but it was banned in most countries by the 1980s because it is highly addictive and has significant side effects.
But it did not go away. It just went underground and became a multi-billion-dollar industry.
Now it is mass-produced in clandestine labs, particularly in Syria and Lebanon. It is often called the poor man's cocaine or the jihad drug. But that second name is a bit misleading because it is not just about religious fervor. It is about the physiology of labor. If you are digging a tunnel for 12 hours straight in a hot, dusty, airless hole, your body is going to scream at you to stop. Your muscles are going to fail and your mind is going to wander. Captagon suppresses those signals.
That is a crucial point. We often attribute the actions of groups like Hamas purely to ideology. And while ideology is the driver, the physical capacity to carry out these tasks, the digging, the 24-hour guard shifts, the sustained combat that requires a biological baseline that the human body often cannot provide on its own. We talked about this in episode 878 when we looked at the science of human resilience. Resilience is often framed as a mental quality, but it has a very real chemical flaw.
If you remove the sensation of hunger, the sensation of fatigue, and the sensation of fear, you have essentially decoupled the ideology from the physiology. The ideology tells them why they are digging, but the Captagon provides the endurance that allows them to actually finish the job. It is a logistical tool as much as a psychological one. It allows a commander to treat his soldiers like machines that only need a pill to keep running.
And we have seen this before. This is not a new phenomenon. If you look back at the history of the Wehrmacht in World War II, they had a very similar relationship with a drug called Pervitin. That was essentially methamphetamine in pill form, manufactured by Temmler-Werke in Berlin. During the invasion of France in 1940, the German soldiers were moving at a pace that the French and British simply could not comprehend.
They were literally outrunning the enemy's ability to process information. The French commanders were operating on a traditional military clock where they assumed the Germans would have to stop and rest every night. But the Germans did not stop. They marched for 3 or 4 days straight without sleep. The entire blitzkrieg was fueled by millions of tablets of Pervitin. It was not just the tanks that were fast, it was the nervous systems of the men inside them.
It is striking how we sanitize this in the history books. We talk about the brilliant tactics of Guderian or Rommel, but we rarely talk about the fact that the entire army was chemically fueled. Even the pilots in the Luftwaffe were using what they called Stuka tablets to keep up the bombing raids during the Battle of Britain. It was a state-sponsored doping program on a national scale.
And it was not just the Germans. The British were using Benzedrine. There is a story that before the Battle of El Alamein, the British military ordered over 1 million tablets of Benzedrine for the troops. General Montgomery himself was reportedly a proponent of its use to keep his men sharp. They realized that if the enemy was using it, they had to use it too just to stay competitive. It becomes a chemical arms race where the finish line is the total exhaustion of the human species.
That brings up a really difficult ethical question. If you are a commander and you know the enemy is chemically optimized, they do not sleep, they do not feel pain the same way, they can work twice as long, is it a moral failure for you to not provide the same tools to your own soldiers? Are you essentially sending your men to die because you want them to remain natural?
That is the dilemma. And in a conservative worldview, where we value the protection of the state and the lives of those who defend it, the answer usually leans toward optimization. But the cost is that you are engineering the humanity out of the soldier. You are turning them into a biological weapon system. You are stripping away the very things, fear, fatigue, empathy, that make us human.
We touched on some of the psychological aspects of this in our previous episodes, but there is a difference between psychological resilience and pharmacological endurance. One is about the strength of the spirit, and the other is about the suppression of the body's warning lights. When you suppress the warning lights, the engine eventually explodes.
That is what happened to the Wehrmacht. By the time the Germans reached the later years of the war, the long-term effects of Pervitin use were devastating. You had soldiers with massive heart issues, permanent psychosis, and total physical collapse. They had burned through their life force to win a few battles in 1940, and by 1944 they were a hollowed-out force. They had taken out a loan from their own biology that they could never pay back.
And we see the same thing with Captagon today. The fighters who use it might feel like Superman in the moment, but the long-term neurological damage is profound. It creates a cycle of dependency where they cannot function without it, which also makes them easier to control by their leaders. It is a form of chemical enslavement. You are not just a soldier for the cause, you are a junkie for the cause.
It is a grim reality, and it is not just the endurance, it is also the aggression. While we talked about modafinil being calm, Captagon and other illicit amphetamines often lower the threshold for violence. They make people more impulsive. When you combine high-intensity ideology with a drug that removes empathy and increases impulsivity, you get the kind of atrocities we have seen in recent years. The drug provides the physiological permission to do things the sober mind would reject.
It makes me think about the berserkers in Viking history. There's long been a theory that they used Amanita muscaria mushrooms or other substances to enter that state of trance-like fury. Whether that is true or not, the myth of the chemically induced warrior is as old as war itself. We have always looked for ways to use chemistry to bypass the human fear response. From the hashish of the Hashashin to the rum rations of the British Navy, alcohol and drugs have always been the grease on the gears of war.
It is a long history. Even the word assassin is widely believed to come from the word hashashin, referring to a group that supposedly used hashish to prepare for their missions, although modern historians debate how much of that was literal versus a derogatory label. In the American Civil War, it was morphine. So many soldiers came home addicted that they called it the soldier's disease.
So, we have talked about the Air Force, and we have talked about the tunnels. What about the broader historical context? Is there any conflict in the last century that was truly natural?
Honestly, probably not. Even if you look at the Vietnam War, the amount of drug use was staggering. But it was different there. A lot of it was self-medication to deal with the trauma rather than state-sponsored enhancement. You had massive heroin and marijuana use among American GIS, but the military was also still dispensing speed like candy. Between 1966 and 1969, the U.S. military used more than 200 million amphetamine tablets. That is a lot of chemically altered decision-making on the ground.
It seems like the shift we are seeing now in 2026 is toward more precision. In the past, it was about just getting everyone high and aggressive. Now, in professional militaries, it is about managing specific cognitive states. We want the pilot to be awake but calm. We want the special operator to be alert but not paranoid. We are moving toward a world of bespoke neurochemistry.
And the next frontier is even more intense. We are starting to see research into beta blockers like propranolol to prevent post-traumatic stress disorder. The idea is to give the drug immediately after a traumatic event to dampen the emotional intensity of the memory as it is being consolidated in the brain. We are talking about drugs that could literally prevent a soldier from feeling the psychological weight of what they are doing in real time.
That is a terrifying thought, Herman. If you remove the psychological cost of war, do you make war more likely? If a soldier can come home and not feel the trauma of the combat, does the society lose its natural check on the use of force? The trauma of the veteran is often the only thing that reminds a society of the true cost of its foreign policy.
That is the ultimate second-order effect. If we make war chemically easy, we might find ourselves doing it a lot more often. It is the same argument people make about drone warfare, that it lowers the threshold for intervention because there are no body bags. But if you do it to the human brain, the effect is even more profound. You are creating a soldier who can kill without consequence, not because they are a psychopath, but because their brain has been chemically shielded from the impact.
Looking at this through the lens of episode 878 and the science of human resilience is revealing. We talked about how the body recovers from captivity and extreme stress. But if the stress is masked by pharmacology during the event, does the recovery process even know how to begin? If the brain never records the trauma as trauma, does it ever heal?
That is a brilliant question, Korn. The brain's healing mechanisms are often tied to the processing of those difficult emotions. If you suppress the emotion with a drug, you might just be burying a ticking bomb in the subconscious. We might be creating a generation of veterans who seem fine on the outside because their neurochemistry was regulated during the war, but who have no internal framework for dealing with what they have seen. They are chemically hollowed out.
Let us get back to the practical side for a moment. For our listeners who are tracking these conflicts in the news today, how can they see the influence of these drugs in the reports they read? What are the telltale signs of a chemically optimized battlefield?
In asymmetric warfare, look for reports of superhuman endurance or bizarre behavior during capture. When you see reports of fighters who continue to advance despite multiple gunshot wounds, or who can dig for days without rest, that is a red flag for stimulant use. In conventional warfare, look for the mission parameters. If you see a pilot flying a mission that is physically impossible for a normal human sleep cycle, you can bet there is a pharmacological protocol behind it. If a unit is operating at high intensity for 72 hours without a break, they are not just well trained, they are well medicated.
And I think it is important to realize that this is not just a military thing anymore. We are seeing the bleed over into civilian life. Modafinil is already widely used as a smart drug by students and high-pressure professionals. The military is just the tip of the spear for how we are all starting to use chemistry to meet the demands of a high-tech, 24/7 world. We are all becoming soldiers in a war against our own biology.
You are right. The line between the soldier and the civilian is blurring when it comes to performance enhancement, but the stakes in war are obviously much higher. If a coder takes modafinil to finish a project, the worst case is some bad code or a burnt-out weekend. If a pilot takes it and has a cognitive lapse during a bombing run, hundreds of people die. The margin for error in military pharmacology is zero.
So, what are the big takeaways here? For me, the first one is that we have to stop looking at war as a purely natural human endeavor. It is a technological and chemical one. When we analyze the success or failure of a group like Hamas in their tunnel construction, we have to account for the Captagon factor. It is a logistical reality as much as the concrete and the steel.
The second takeaway is that there is no free lunch in biology. Every time we use a drug to bypass a human limitation, we are taking out a loan. Whether it is the U.S. Air Force or an insurgent in a tunnel, that debt eventually comes due. The question for society is whether the mission is worth the long-term cost to the individual's brain and soul. We are trading the future health of our soldiers for the immediate success of the mission.
I also think we need to be more honest about the chemical arms race. We often talk about missiles and cyber warfare, but the development of new cognitive enhancers is just as important to the future of conflict. The side that can keep its soldiers awake and focused for 48 hours longer than the other side has a massive tactical advantage. It is a critical factor.
It is. And as we move toward 2027 and 2028, I expect we will see even more targeted substances. We are moving away from the blunt force of amphetamines and toward things that can specifically tune the brain for different tasks. Drugs for focus, drugs for calm, drugs for memory suppression. It is a brave new world of neuropharmacology where the soldier is just a wetware component.
It is unsettling to think about where it ends. Are we eventually going to have soldiers who are so chemically altered that they struggle to relate to the civilian population they are supposed to be protecting? We already see the struggle with reintegration, and this just adds another layer of complexity. If you have been chemically optimized for war, how do you ever settle for the mundane reality of peace?
It complicates things, but as long as there is conflict, there will be a demand for anything that gives an edge. The human body was not designed for modern kinetic warfare. It was designed for short bursts of activity followed by long periods of rest. War demands the opposite, and chemistry is the only way to bridge that gap. We are forcing a prehistoric brain to operate in a postmodern environment.
This has been a sobering look at the reality of modern combat. It definitely changes the way I look at the news reports coming out of the Middle East and elsewhere. It is not just about the weapons they carry. It is about the chemistry in their blood.
Me too. Every time I see a report about those tunnels now, I am going to be thinking about the chemistry that made them possible. It is not just shovels and concrete, it is phenethylene and dopamine. It is a subterranean city built on a foundation of synthetic stimulants.
And hey, if you have been enjoying these deep dives into the weirder corners of history and technology, we would really appreciate it if you could leave us a review on your podcast app. Whether you are on Spotify or Apple Podcasts, those reviews really help new people find the show and join our community of the curious.
They really do. We love seeing the community grow and hearing your feedback. And remember, you can find all our past episodes, including the ones we mentioned today about resilience and global conflict, at our website, myweirdprompts.com. We have a full archive there and a contact form if you want to send us your own prompts or thoughts on today's episode.
This has been a great one, Herman. I think we really pulled back the curtain on something that most people only see the surface of. We are looking at the invisible architecture of war.
I agree. It is a heavy topic, but an important one if you want to understand the world as it actually is, not just as we wish it to be. The future of war is chemical, and we are already living in it.
Well said. Thanks for listening to my weird prompts. We will be back soon with another deep dive into the prompts that keep us up at night.
Hopefully, without the help of Modafinil.
Speak for yourself. I am a sloth, remember? I need all the help I can get just to make it to the studio.
Fair point. Until next time, everyone.
Take care.
Goodbye.
This episode was generated using Gemini Flash 3. Text-to-speech engine was Chatterbox.
Thanks for listening to our show, my weird prompts, where our thoughts go from slow takes to facts on cue. We change and follow through. My weird prompts, that's the close from sloth, from man, from long-eared host. My weird prompts, until next time, stay curious, keep